Welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, I don't just make pottery, I make resources such as books and courses for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about me sharing everything I've learned with you, and I can't wait to get started. Let's go! Hello! So before we get on with the episode, I wanted to tell you about two completely free guides that I've made just for you about pottery. And the first guide is called How to Make a Pottery Glaze. So if you've ever been curious about how to make your own pottery glaze, this guide will show you exactly how to make your own glaze from start to finish. It tells you all the ingredients you need. It tells you step by step how to make the glaze, how to stay safe when glaze making, and it's got a stoneware glaze recipe in there. And if you've been curious about how to fire pottery, I have also made a guide on electric kiln firing. So this guide will tell you all the different terms that's used in like kiln firing, and what they mean, and it also takes you through the exact firing schedule that I use to do my bisque firing and also stoneware glaze firing. So it's got all the temperatures in there, all the timings in there, and both of these guides are available from the Oxford Clay website at www.oxfordclay.co.uk/resources for potters. Okay, let's get on with the episode. Hello and welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I'm really excited to be back here with you today. I'm going to be talking to you today about making your own plaster mould in pottery. So this might sound like really advanced like pottery stuff, but making your own plaster mould is so good because plaster moulds in pottery are fantastic for being able to basically reproduce the same shape over and over again. And then what you can do is you can use kind of like all your creativity, in the decoration or like the glazing part of it, but it enables you to get like a very similar shape over and over again. So, if you want to make like a set of something, a plaster mold would be great. If you want to make the same size bowl, every time or something, a plaster mold is fantastic. So you can use a plaster mould as a press mould, where basically you're pressing clay into it, you're leaving it to dry a little bit. The clay will, come away from the plaster because the water is sucked out. Or you can actually use a plaster mould for slip casting. And slip casting is essentially when you're pouring like a liquid clay into a plaster mould. It's exactly the same principle as a press mold. Basically, it's just that you're pouring the clay in, you're pouring the clay back out again, you're leaving it for a certain amount of time, you're pouring it back out again, and then again, that shape, the clay shape will shrink in the plaster mold as the plaster draws the water away, and then you can lift the item out. So if you think about like pretty much all commercial pottery, that you'd see in the supermarket, or say like a ceramic thing in the bathroom, like a sink or something, all of those things are actually slip cast. And so it enables basically pottery, the industrial process, to be like shapes to be replicated very easily over and over again, and you get this high quality shape. You're not having to, you're saving loads of time, you're not having to hand build stuff every time. So it's a fantastic thing for potters to have access to your own mold. Okay, so I'm gonna basically just talk you through how I make my plaster molds, and then hopefully you'll be able to see that, like, it's something that is, available to you. You can definitely do it too. I basically learned from like books, and I also like watched a few kind of like YouTube videos, in terms of like how to actually cast, because that was the thing to get my head around, sort of like the shape aspect of it. That was the thing that I found like the most difficult to understand. So I'm gonna like just try and explain that to you now, basically. So essentially, when you're making a mold, like a one part mold, so it's called one part because it's basically just one block of plaster and then a kind of, depression that you're going to be like either pouring clay into or pressing clay into. You absolutely need it to not have any overhangs. Okay, so what I mean by that is that the shape you're making the mold out of, needs to be wider at the rim than at the base. Okay, so, and that is because when you cast and you make your piece in the mold, you want it to be able to lift out when it starts to dry. So if you think about like a vase shape, if a vase is like, bigger at the base and narrower at the rim, if you tried to cast that in a one part mold, you wouldn't be able to like pull the vase out, when it was drying because it would be bigger at the base and it would get stuck. So that's why things that are that have an overhang, like vases, that they're basically cast in two-part molds. Okay, so we're not going to cover like two-part molds, but essentially, basically, it's just like two halves of the mold that come together and they create this kind of cavern that then you can pour slip into. So I'd say like a one part mold is just like, a really fantastic way of like getting into mold making. That's basically what I did. And, later on I tried to make one with a vase with kind of like varying success, but, a two-part mold. But you can actually buy, multi-part molds from like a commercial pottery supplier. So there'll be companies that actually make these molds, they kind of like, they can make, even like say for a vase, they'll make like a three-part mold where basically it's like two sides coming together, and then quite often it'll be a base, and they're like held together with like either like a mold strap, they're sometimes called, or can be like a very thick kind of piece of rubber band sort of thing, and they're all held together and they're cast into that. So so what I'm going to tell you about today is how I make my one part molds, and they don't have any overhangs. I actually use an enamel pie dish, which is like a really fantastic shape to make a kind of like a soap dish kind of shape. So it makes this like beautiful kind of oval, sort of shallow oval dish. And then what I do is after I've slip cast that, I then like add decoration onto it. So like I have like sprig molds again that I then I add like dragonflies, and a sprig mold is just like a little tiny mold where you can like make a decoration by pushing a bit of clay into it. So I use those molds to then create like beautiful shapes like with like butterflies and dragonflies that then I put onto my my dish shape, which I cast in this plaster mold. Okay, so step one. Okay, so the step one is that you need to find some kind of shape that you want to cast. Okay, so like I was just saying to you, it's got to be bigger at the top, smaller at the bottom, and have no kind of like, I guess, like sticky out bits that are going to get caught when you are going to lift the shape out. So if you always think of like, just think to yourself, would I be able to lift this shape out? Would there be any overhangs that would stop this shape getting just lifted out, of this one part mold? So that's the first thing to say. The shape is a really key thing. And then the second thing is that the material that you're casting is also a really key thing. So it's got to be shiny and non-porous. So you can cast slightly porous things like ceramics, but I have found that sometimes, you then have problems separating the plaster from the thing you're casting. So the shinier it is, the better, really. And like ideally you want something which is like quite solid, because it's going to be under quite a lot of pressure when that plaster is quite heavy, it's going to be like poured onto it. So, you know, if you think about if you're going to cast something that's like plastic, you want quite like a heavy duty plastic. And you also want it to be like safe. So you don't, I mean, you can cast glass because it's shiny, but again, you know, you might have this issue when you're trying to separate the mold from the thing you're casting. You just want to be like as safe as possible. So I found metal things actually the very, very best thing to cast. So like I was saying to you, I cast like an enamel pie dish. So enamel, metal enamel things, or like something that's stainless steel, those things are so good to cast because also the metal can be like ever so slightly flexible, which will also help separate the mold from the thing you've cast at the end. Okay, so that's the thing to say. So it's like the shape, the thing it's made of, and then the next thing is that you need is some kind of container in which to cast. So this is my absolute top tip for making a mold. I would say that like, although some potters build their own kind of spaces to cast in, so you basically need a space to like contain the plaster. So although you can build that yourself with like a kind of frame, and you can put kind of stick clay around it and stuff to kind of like stop the plaster from leaking out. What I found is that the absolute best thing to do is to have some kind of like container already that is like, you know, the plaster's not going to leak out of. So I found like Tupperware pots, you know, like you can get quite large Tupperware pots, you know, that are just like for food and stuff. I've actually found like those plastic pots so good to cast in because you can pour all the plaster in there over your thing that you're casting, and you know that plaster is not going to run out. And it also just creates a really lovely like mold shape, you know. So those are the three things you need: something to cast, you need it to be, you know, a certain material, nice and shiny, quite solid, and you need something to cast into. So like, you know, a plastic pot is great, or a bucket. Could do a bucket, but the great thing about like a Tupperware pots is that quite often, you know, again, you're going to need that piece of plaster to come out of whatever you're casting. So you're going to need the rim to be bigger than the base, or you're just going to need it to have straight sides. Okay. So yeah, bucket's ideal, you know, because they've got a bigger rim. Tupperware's ideal because they've got a bigger rim. There we go. Right. So, okay, the next thing is, this is the kind of technical bit, I suppose. The next thing you need to do is you need to actually put your thing that you're going to cast in situ into the Tupperware pot. So just for the purposes of this episode, this is how I do it. Basically, I just want to tell you about like me casting into this Tupperware pot. So I basically use, it's quite a large Tupperware pot. You know, maybe sort of like, I don't know, maybe like 2 litres big. And what I do is I use an enamel pie dish and I turn it upside down so that you're basically going to be casting around the base of the dish. So the base of the dish is going to become the inside of your mould because you're going to be pouring plaster on top of it. So I hope that makes sense. It's basically like, you're always going to be casting the base of something. So if you kind of like, you know, if you're always thinking like, oh, that's a nice shape, you're not going to be ever casting the inside of it. You're going to be casting the outside of it because that's going to create like the space that you're going to be then, you know, that's going to create your mold basically. So if, it's quite hard to look at things just normally, like when you go to the supermarket and stuff, or like, you know, when you're like in a charity shop or something, you start to think of everything like, oh, could I cast that? Or like, oh, I wonder how that would cast and stuff. And you're always looking for the kind of profile of it, the outside, the base of it. And that's the thing that's going to be cast basically. Okay, so you've got your Tupperware pot, you've got your enamel pie dish or bowl or something, and then you're going to put the dish, you're going to put it upside down into the Tupperware pot, okay? And then what I do then is I seal all around the rim because you don't want any plaster going up like inside the pot or the dish, whatever you're casting. You want it to be totally sealed because that would kind of compromise like the integrity of the molds that you're making, you know, if plaster starts like running underneath and stuff. So you want to create a really, really tight seal all around the rim of the thing that you're casting. Okay, so if you imagine this pie dish upside down into like a Tupperware box, basically, with clay all around the side. You can also push clay sort of like all in, you know, in the rest of the base. So you do the clay all around the dish, and then, like, you know, all in the rest of the base, and do a layer of clay. And that's going to form like a very tight seal for the plaster when you pour it in. Okay, so the next step is to put some kind of like lubrication agent between. You want to try and put that onto, what you're trying to do is make a kind of you want it to be as easy as possible to separate the plaster from whatever you're casting. Because even if you're casting something that's very shiny and not porous, it still can be really hard to separate the plaster and the thing you're casting, because it's a sort of, you know, airtight seal is made and stuff. So any help that you can give yourself, you know, any sort of like, you know, extra lubrication is a really good idea. So things I found that work really well for this. I've heard some potters use WD-40. I read that in a book. Or you could maybe use, you know, some kind of synthetic like lubricant, like maybe like bike oil or something. But I actually just use cooking oil. So I use like I've found that sesame oil is it's a really light kind of oil. It's fantastic, and it's like, I basically just pour a little bit on a piece of kitchen roll, and then I just wipe it over the surface of the like the enamel pie dish, like the upside down enamel pie dish. And that just creates you don't want too much of this, because it might you know, get in the way of the plaster and make a non-smooth surface. But that just creates a really good surface that the plaster is just like hopefully not going to stick to. Don't want that plaster sticking to the thing you're casting. It's such a nightmare. So so hopefully that'll be enough to kind of stop that from happening. And some potters actually use a thing called mold maker's size, which is kind of like it's like a soap type agent. And if you're ever casting something that is porous, because some potters actually make casts out of plaster, which is amazing. So plaster is extremely porous, and so they need to use loads and loads of layers of mold maker's size. Basically soaks into whatever it you know, the porous surface, and creates a kind of like kind of, you know, soap basically on the outside. But if you're casting something that is non-porous, you don't really need mold maker's size. You just need some kind of lubricant. Mold maker's size is quite tricky as well, because it can kind of react with the plaster. If you use too much, it can often kind of make your mold like not very smooth, because it's sort of like, you know, there's soap in there sort of thing. So I found that cooking oil is actually like a great thing to use, just a teeny weeny bit, just like rubbed on to your thing that you're casting. Okay, so now for the exciting bit. You're going to be mixing up some plaster of Paris that you're going to be then pouring on top of your shape in the Tupperware dish. Okay, so I always get a bit nervous at this stage actually when I'm doing it, because like it's a bit like time is like ticking away. You know, as soon as you add water and plaster together, you've only got a certain amount of time to actually do your thing, do what you need to do before it like sets, and then you could potentially have like plaster disaster on your hands. So my top tips for using plaster, firstly, use cold water to mix it up. If you use hot water or warm water, like I did once, it basically sets it really fast, and you have like no chance to make your mold, to pour it around your thing. So you've really got to use cold water. The next top tip is to mix it really, really well. Now, this might seem like kind of counterintuitive. You think, oh, if I'm mixing it really well, it's probably going to set quicker and stuff, but it's so important to mix it really well to get a smooth plaster. So I usually mix it with a spatula, and then I actually use, you can actually use an electric kind of stick blender, you know, like you would use in the kitchen for like making soups or something. That is actually great for like zhuzhing it, you know, like sort of really, really mixing it, making sure it's really well mixed. It's quite thick, but it does work. And then what I normally do is like just sort of stir it with my hand to make sure there's no lumps at all left, kind of like on the bottom and stuff of the bucket that I'm mixing it in. Okay, so those are the plaster tips. And actually, it's really important to tell you that when you're mixing plaster for mold making, you really need a very hard plaster. So the way you get a really hard plaster is by making sure that the ratio of plaster of Paris to water is like very high. So you want lots of plaster of Paris to water. And by making sure that you've got that ratio, it's going to make the plaster as hard as possible. So generally speaking, the more water you add to plaster, the kind of less hard it is, you know. So I, for example, use a ratio of about 2 parts plaster to 1 part water, with a little bit more water thrown in there, because I found that 2 to 1, 2 parts plaster to 1 part water is actually just like not quite enough to make actually like a pourable plaster. It's actually like not quite enough water, but it makes a very, very hard plaster, and that's like perfect for making your mold. It'd be very like, you know, very durable mold. It'd be brilliant. So okay, so what you want to do is measure out your water and plaster, and then you want to have like a large bucket of water on standby for kind of like quickly washing all the things in. You know, when you're mixing the plaster, you might need to take a bit of that water to add to the general mixture of plaster if it's like not quite pourable enough. So that's my very top tip, like to have a kind of like a bucket of water on standby, you know, because you'll need to like wash everything quite fast. And you absolutely do not want to be putting plaster down the sink, because it will set in your sink pipes and cause you like loads of annoying problems. So you just like, if you have any plaster left over from casting, just pour it out on like a piece of newspaper or a piece of cardboard and just let it set there, and then you can like discard it afterwards. And you can also wipe out any buckets with newspaper as well. So that's a really good way of like kind of getting rid of the majority of plaster like in a bucket. Wipe it out with, you know, screwed up newspaper, just wipe it out, and then you can like put it in the sort of rubbish rather than putting it down the sink. But having like a bucket of water on standby is great, because then you can, you know, you can rinse any tools like spatula and stuff like that. You know, your hands, you know, maybe your stick blender before the plaster sets. So you want to be doing that, before the plaster sets, and you can then just like, you know, chuck out the water with the kind of set plaster in, you know, preferably like don't put that down the sink, just kind of maybe like chuck it on the garden or something. You don't want, like if plaster's set, then, you know, that's fine. You can probably just scoop it out with your hand and put it in the bin, but you don't really want to be putting you can put the top water down the sink, but don't put any plaster down the sink. Okay, so you've got your plaster, you've weighed it out, you've got your water, you've got sort of like twice as much plaster to water. And what you want to do is put your water into the bucket that you're going to be making your plaster mix up in. And then you want to sprinkle the plaster on top, okay? And that's a really good way of getting like less lumps in your plaster. So you just sprinkle it on top, don't breathe it in. You know, if possible, use an FFP3 face mask. Use like goggles. You don't want to be getting plaster in your lungs, in your eyes, you know, because it will create a kind of dust when it goes into the bucket, and you just want to avoid that really. So, but you're sprinkling the plaster into the water, and it kind of like all kind of like soaks down. You leave it for a few minutes, maybe like say like 5 minutes or something, just to kind of all soak in there, and then you can start stirring it all together, and then the time is ticking away, and then you've got to like quickly get it into your Tupperware dish. Okay, so the next stage is to pour it all into your mold, you know, so it goes all around the item that you're casting, it goes all like, you know, into the Tupperware dish, and then once it's all like, you know, filled up, you've got like lots of plaster in there, the dish is completely covered with another kind of maybe like 3 maybe inches, you know, sort of like maybe even 10 centimeters, you know, above the thing you're casting with plaster. So you want it like all the plaster all around the dish, because that's, you know, you need quite a lot of plaster around the thing you're casting to be able to make an adequate mold to soak in enough water when you actually come to like cast your thing. You know, you need to have quite a big mold, if you think about like a kind of small space in the middle that you're going to be like casting your shape in, sort of thing. So yeah, because you need quite a lot of plaster to soak in the water basically when you're actually making your thing. So okay, so when you've poured all the plaster in, you want to just like knock your kind of do a few knocks on the floor, or sort of pick up your Tupperware dish and kind of bang it on the ground or on the table, because you want to kind of try and get rid of any air bubbles in that dish. You don't want any air bubbles around the thing you're casting, because although it's not like an absolute huge disaster, you can fill in air bubbles later with a little bit of like plaster that you mix up, sort of, and just pushing it into the air bubbles. You really don't want to have air bubbles that that you're having to like fill in. It's something, if you can try and just get rid of those air bubbles at this stage, it's really brilliant, and it means that you'll have a lovely smooth shape when it comes to separating them. Okay, so the next stage is just to like clean up like as quickly as you can before all the plaster sets like in the bucket and stuff. So like a race against time to get everything clean before you have like set plaster in a bucket that you can't like get rid of. So let's just pretend, fast forward, that we've done all that and it's all like lush and clean and brilliant, and now we've got our like mold that is like gradually setting. So like at this stage, I would say it's probably a great idea just have like a little break, like make yourself like a cup of tea or something. That's what I usually do. Just have like, the plaster disaster's been averted. We've got everything clean. It's all good. We haven't poured plaster down the sink. It's brilliant. And all the thing you're casting is just setting away just there. So in terms of like, so you're drinking your tea, having a nice break, and you just want to be checking on the thing, your block of plaster. You just want to be checking on it, because there's an optimum time to turn it out of the Tupperware dish and to try and separate the thing you've cast from your mould. So so I found this out basically through like lots of kind of trial and error. And so there's like different stages to plaster hardening. Okay, so the first stage is that it's like, it feels quite hard, but actually it's still quite soft plaster. So this is the stage when it feels like it's set, but actually it hasn't started. It's like the reaction that it goes through when it starts to get hot. So when it starts to get hot, that is the optimum stage I've found to actually try and separate the thing you've cast from your block of plaster. So any time before that, and the mold is going to be probably too soft, and you might end up like accidentally breaking it. So just don't touch it for a few minutes. It won't take very long to start getting hot. But what I found as well is that when I've left so there was one time when I tried to cast a mold, and I actually left it for like, I think like a couple of days, and I came back to it and it was actually really difficult to separate the mould from the thing I'd cast. So I think what I found is that time when it's starting to get hot is actually the absolute optimum time to separate the two things. And that's because quite often the heat reaction can kind of help to separate the thing you've cast from the block of plaster. So what I do is I take a tea towel and I just like put that on the floor or the table, and then I take the Tupperware pot of plaster that's heating up, and I turn it upside down and I like knock it to get it out of its Tupperware pot. So like it sometimes can take like a few sort of like knocking quite hard like on the floor or the table, and that's why I put the tea towel down, because I don't want to be damaging the mould at that stage. But generally it does come out of the plastic Tupperware pot, and that's all good. You can kind of like just put that to the side and clean it later. And then what I then do, so then you're left with this kind of, enamel pie dish, like in a block of plaster, and hopefully no plaster is kind of run underneath, so you've got your clay. So I basically take the clay away from the outside, but quite often whatever you're casting, the pie dish or something, will be stuck in the plaster. And it's at this stage where you've just got to be like super careful when you're trying to separate them, because this is quite often when you can damage a mold. So my top tips for this are basically just go really gently as possible. Do it when the plaster is like getting hot, because that can often help. Use some kind of like wooden tool, like a blunt wooden tool can often help as well. And sometimes if you've cast something which is like a tiny bit flexible, like, you know, a metal or like maybe a plastic thing, don't try this with glass. You can just kind of knock it ever so slightly with like maybe, you know, something blunt, maybe like a rolling pin or something, just very gently kind of knock it, and that can sometimes break the kind of airlock, and then it means that, you know, the dish can come out of the mould. So, you know, it can be really frustrating if they're, you know, kind of completely joined together, but if you're using something that's not porous, generally it'll be because there's like an airlock there that you just have to break. And then this is like the moment of truth, because when the shape comes out of the mold, then you can see if there's any air bubbles, you can see if the surface is smooth, because this is going to be the surface that you're going to be casting into, or you're going to be like, you know, press molding in, you know, you're going to be pressing clay into. So you want it to be a nice smooth surface. You don't want any air bubbles there. You know, you don't want the plaster to be grainy. So, you know, hopefully by mixing the plaster really well and by, you know, knocking it on the surface, you know, when you've poured the plaster in, you're knocking those air bubbles to the surface. Yeah, like hopefully you won't, you know, you'll have like a lovely smooth like surface, and your mold will be like ready. Okay, so the very final stages are, there's just 2 stages left. The first one, which is really good to do at this stage before the plaster is completely hardened, is just to kind of like shave off any sharp edges from the sort of sides of the mold that aren't the thing that you've cast, if that makes sense. So you want to kind of like leave that area alone. You don't want to be sort of, you know, doing anything to that. But actually, saying that, I have seen in books and stuff, some potters can kind of, you know, they've like used this stage where the plaster's a little bit soft to kind of like scratch things into it. So, you know, the world's your oyster in terms of like you know, the creative things available to you at this point. You could scratch like a design into your plaster mold. Yeah, I saw this in this book once. It was like really beautiful. They had got some like pieces of plaster, like flat plaster, and then they'd etched a beautiful design in, and then they kind of used that to like roll clay over, and it was really beautiful. But generally speaking, I just use like a smooth mold, and yeah, and I just like use that to cast and stuff. But you don't want any sharp edges like of the other sides, if you know what I mean. So like the outside of it, you don't want any kind of like, because you don't want any like sharp bits of plaster, and you don't want any bits of plaster like breaking off, because quite often, you know, when you've poured it, there'll be kind of sharp bits that, you know, that kind of go up the sides of the Tupperware dish and stuff. So what you can do here is you can either use a like a kind of like sometimes DIY stores actually will have these kind of metal sanders that you can use, and you just kind of like can scrape it with one of those. They work really well with plaster. Or yeah, it's like a kind of grate thing that goes into like a plastic tool that then you can just, you know, use to kind of like kind of sand, but like kind of scrape around the side. Or you can actually just use a knife, or even like a spoon, like a teaspoon or something, you know, to scrape the edges, just to make the edges like nice and smooth. The other edges of the mold. Okay, so that's the second final that's the second final step, and then the very final step is to let your mold dry before you use it. Okay, so I read in a book that you absolutely shouldn't dry plaster by heating it. Okay, so it might seem like, oh, this is great, I can just like dry it, you know, in a kiln, or I can dry it on top of the kiln or something, or, you know, in a heated, like on a radiator or something like that. But in this book, it was basically saying don't dry it with heat, because you can end up like compromising the integrity of the plaster. So plaster apparently doesn't like to be heated too hot, and so, you know, you can end up basically damaging your mold, all your hard work, you know, like. So it was saying, if you want, in this book that I read, it was saying if you wanted to dry your mold a bit faster, you can like pass a lot of air over it. So say like dry it outside on a windy day, a few windy days, or you can have a fan kind of like putting air over it, sort of thing. But it's like important just to let you know that like they will take a long time to dry. So before you cast into your mold, you need to let it dry. It needs to be like bone dry basically before you use it, because otherwise it's not going to be absorbing the water enough, and that clay is not going to come out basically. So although it's like a bit annoying, you have to think ahead like quite a long time, so like even like 3 or 4 weeks sometimes it can take to dry out a mold. I actually just dry mine on like a cooling rack that you'd use for like a cake or something. If you bake a cake, you turn it out on the rack that you can just get from the supermarket. I actually just dry them on those, and I just generally dry them for about 3-4 weeks before using them. And another thing to say is that, because the cake rack will sort of let the air sort of like, circulate all around them and dry them. Another thing to say is that when you come to use your mold, before you start kind of using it properly, generally the advice is to make something in it that you then just like discard, because there is a chance that like some little bits of plaster will come off in that first one. The first one you either slip cast or use as a press mold, and so what they say is like discard the first one that you use in that mold, and then from then on you can just start using it, use your mold, slip cast in it, use it as a pressed mold. It's just that like you don't want any bits of plaster in your clay at all. So just be like super careful when you're making molds, like not to get any plaster like in the clay at all. So that's the idea of discarding that like first one, is like if there's any bits of plaster that might have come off, they'll like have gone with that one, then you can just like chuck that first one away basically. That's the advice. So I hope that's been like interesting in terms of like hearing how like I make a mold. Like I said to you, I made one yesterday out of like this enamel pie dish in a Tupperware pot. It's good. I always get a little bit stressed when it's like the plaster time, I have to say, but once I get through that, it's okay. It's like quite a lot of like washing up and stuff, but it is so worth it, because you get this like beautiful shape that you can just use over and over again. And it means, you can have consistency. Like I was saying to you, you can make sets of things, you can really let your creativity like go wild with like the decoration. And it's such a fantastic, thing to have, enable you to keep it for, they say you can use plaster molds, 100 times or something. And I've used ones that I've got plaster molds that I've used over 100 times. So you can keep them for a really long time, and they're brilliant. So thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I've loved telling you about making a plaster mold, and I can't wait to see you on the next episode. Until then, happy potting, and I'll see you then. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me for the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Oxford Clay or eco-conscious pottery, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website. There's books, e-courses, there's a blog on there, loads of other podcast episodes, and I can't wait to share it with you. The web address is oxfordclay.co.uk. I'll see you over there.